Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Powerful Perspectives. I want to talk to you today a little bit about ageism, about the attitudes that we have towards different age groups in society. Specifically, I want to focus in on attitudes towards the elderly and attitudes towards the youth. So like the teenagers, kind of the younger generation, the rising generation. Not so much children, but specifically like teenagers and youth. And specifically like how they view each other. So if you take the elderly population and you kind of take in general the attitudes that they often have towards the youth, towards the teenagers, that are kind of growing up these days, the attitudes tend to be pretty critical. I'm sure many of you have heard such attitudes before. Common themes are that the teenagers of today, the youth of today, the young people of today are lacking in a lot of different areas. They lack knowledge, wisdom, experience. They lack respect. They lack morals and values. They lack any sense of tradition. That they're not cultured maybe, or they don't have that same grounding. They don't have that structure, again, that respect, that regard maybe for other people. These are, I think, some of the common critiques maybe of youth from the elderly generation, looking at them. And the general consensus seems to be, okay, like the young people of today are basically running us into the ground. They're ruining humanity, ruining the world. Not the nicest outlook, pretty critical often of the youth and of the rising generation. And again, I'm not speaking for everybody here. Certainly there are some elderly people who hold a different opinion, and I don't want to brush over those. Like, certainly this is not universal, but it is a common trend or a common attitude that I have personally witnessed and perceived in my conversations with elderly people. I've worked with elderly people in many different capacities throughout my lifetime. I've had the opportunity to, and seeing how they describe younger generations, even amongst different cultures in different countries that I've had the chance to spend time with and interact with the elderly population in these different countries. These have tended to be pretty persistent themes that have come up in terms of how they regard the teenagers of today. Flipping to the other side, if you talk to a lot of teenagers and youth these days and ask them what their perspectives are regarding the elderly, or even if you don't ask them, but you just kind of listen and observe and see how they interact with the elderly, they'll often express those ideas themselves. Same thing with the elderly. Oftentimes, like both age groups don't necessarily need to be prompted to share their opinions about the other. It can tend to come quite organically. But attitudes often held by the youth and teenagers towards the elderly is that they are ancient, rigid, kind of stuck up, that they're stubborn, that they are intolerant and outdated, insensitive, and that they're kind of old-fashioned. And you get this general sense or this general theme of like, we've outgrown you, is kind of the message that you hear from the younger people. It's like, yeah, like things were that way back when. And that way of thinking, those mindsets, those attitudes, they may have been relevant then, but the world has changed and it's a different place now. And anything that you have to say, any opinion that you hold, anything that you have to tell me is dated, and it's outdated. Like it's just we've passed that. We've evolved past that. It's no longer relevant. we've kind of outgrown it, is kind of this general theme. And again, like, not speaking for everyone, there are plenty of youth who might hold different opinions about the elderly in general, or about specific individuals within the elderly community, right? But an overwhelming theme or attitude that kind of seems to be there in a majority, is, I think, what I've just offered. Again, you could feel free to disagree with me. I'd love to hear, like, if you have opposing thoughts or different perspectives, please, like, I'd love to hear it in the comments. These are just kind of the things that I have recognized and observed. And I think it's interesting that kind of from both ends, right? From the younger end of the spectrum looking up in age, and from the older end of the spectrum looking down in age, both perspectives tend to be pretty critical, tend to be pretty, in some ways, almost adversarial, like just very dismissive, very disgusted, like frustrated, annoyed, like they just, there's not really a lot of mutual respect or positive regard in attitudes between these age groups and how they perceive each other. And I personally look at that and I think that's rather sad, because in reality, if both age groups could take a moment to step back and be a little bit more humble, I think each would recognize that they have a lot that they could learn from each other, that there is a lot of information, experience, perspective that is of value from each. There are a lot of things that the older generation can teach the younger. Some examples that come out of the top of my head, again, if you have additional ones, like, comment them below, I'd love to hear them. Some things that come to my mind are the elderly generation has, because they've lived longer, they have seen how history has developed. And so the younger generation is really good at seeing what is right now, right? Like, they know how things are in the present moment, and they understand that to a better degree than the elderly generation, right? That's something they can share with the elderly generation. It's like, okay, this is how things are now. This is the current climate, the current atmosphere, the current place where we are in our advances with technology, with media, with, well, optimistically, I'd like to say with international relations. Sometimes those aren't always as advanced as we would like them to be, but whatever it is, economy, another tough spot maybe, politics, whatever, right? But like, they're able to describe what the current layout is, because they're living in it and they're active in it, whereas the elderly generation is kind of observing it, but from a different perspective, and not really as active in it in the same way as the younger generation, right? But the older generation has seen how this has developed, how it has grown, how we have come to where we are now. Because it's one thing to see and understand and know where things are and how things are now. It's another thing completely to know why. And that is something that the older generation has a lot more insight into, because they have just seen where it's come from, right? They've seen the progression, they've seen the growth, they've seen the development in a way that the younger generation just wasn't around to see, right? So they don't have that same access to that information. And even if they do, right, because I mean, we live in a world where, thankfully, like with the internet and everything, like, and research and just all these articles, like, information is at our fingertips, and we are able to access information very easily, like very easily and very quickly. The modern, or like the current difficulty is almost an overload of information. And our current challenge is actually choosing between information, and discerning between what information is credible and correct and trustworthy, and what information is false, is fabricated, has an agenda, right? Like there's an overload, an overwhelming of information. It's too much, and we have to now be selective with our information. But even if you do find, like even if the younger generation, if they want to, most of the younger generation aren't too keen on just sitting and doing research and learning stuff, right? But for those who do have that curiosity and who do want to spend that time, you can find the information, but it's always going to be from a certain perspective. It's always going to be from a certain angle. And again, you have to be selective about, okay, like which opinion, which perspective on this information am I going to choose? Do I feel is actually most accurate and most correct? And most of it is going to be descriptive, like in terms of it'll hopefully be factual and accurately factual, but there will also be like oftentimes bias mixed in there and everything. But it's different reading about it or like watching videos about it or whatever. It's very different from living it, experiencing it, having that level of interaction, right? The older generation knows this stuff not because someone told them, not because they are operating on faith to an extent of what, believing something that someone else has said or relying on certain sources. They know it because they've lived it, they've experienced it, they were there when it happened, they saw it, they interacted with it, they reacted to it, it influenced their lives. It's a very different quality of knowledge, very different quality of learning, very different quality of experience, right? And that is something that is invaluable. It's something that can't be taken away from them. Except maybe like through dementia or things like this, right? Like for those who have memory loss. But that experience, like you can't buy that, right? You can't. It's hard to put that in a book, and even reading it from a book, you don't feel it the same way. And so that's something that like the older generation has to give to the younger, is just they see how things have developed into what they are and why they are the way that they are. They have that broader perspective, right? Another thing that I would add, it's kind of similar, there's maybe some overlap, but it's a little bit different as well, is, and this is just a truth that like an age-old, time-old truth that a lot of the younger generation don't really understand yet. And that is that there are some things in life that are timeless. There are some things that are not specific to a certain time period, to a certain moment in the development of the human species. There are some things that are not they're not just fads, that kind of like wax and wane, like in and out of, well, maybe waxing and waning isn't the best because that's like more of a repetitive, but like they're not just blips in the history of humanity. There are some things that come back, and sometimes they come back in cycles, right? There are things that there are patterns that repeat themselves throughout history. And there are some things that are just constant. They're always there. No matter what point in history you choose, you're going to find it. And this is something that the younger generation just doesn't see yet. They haven't been around long enough to witness it. The older generation has seen this, right? They've witnessed multiple generations of the human family, come and go. They have seen the consistency. They have seen those things that are constant, and they've seen those things that maybe aren't constant, but that like kind of come in and out, right? Those things that repeat, those things, how history repeats itself. They've seen that, and the younger generation hasn't. And so that's another area where the elderly generation has insight, and they can offer that perspective, because it's valuable. It's valuable. The sooner you learn about those elements of human life and just, yeah, interactions and social engagement and just all of these things that are constant, and the things that repeat themselves, that are like patterns that are just kind of ongoing, that might change in quality in a specific time, but like they're kind of cyclical. Learning those is huge in understanding what to expect from life and how to engage with it and how to prepare for it, and yeah, how to place yourself in this world. So yeah, really interesting things that the older generation can give the younger generation if they'll take the time to listen. And I'm sure there's other things too. Maybe it'll come to me in a minute. But some things that the younger generation has that they can teach the older generation. I mentioned before, like how things are now, right? How things have changed, because the older generation recognizes and sees change, but because they see it with a broader perspective, with more history, with more experience, they kind of see it through that lens of, again, those patterns and that consistency, right? And so, yeah, they'll see how some things are vastly different from how they were when they were younger, when the older generation was younger. They'll see the differences, but oftentimes the differences are just reinventions of the old thing. It's the same story repeating itself, just with different characters, different, like the plot is the same, the setting is kind of the same. There might be a couple little twists, a couple little like nuances or side stories like that are a little bit different, but like the main message, like the meat and potatoes of it is oftentimes the same or very similar. Yeah, changes, although significant in many ways, they're not often different in principle. At the core, they're just different expressions. They look different on the outside, but at the core, the same things that have always kind of been there are often still there. And so the older generation, if they're reflective and attentive, and if they're paying attention, if they're observing, like if you know, oftentimes they'll see that. They'll kind of see how, yeah, okay, like this is kind of, it's different but the same, you know, and things that happen today that are kind of like new in the eyes of the younger generation, the older generation will say, oh yeah, that reminds me of this thing that we had when I was younger, or this place, or this thing that happened, like, and the younger generation kind of gets tired of hearing that, right? Like, oh no, like this isn't like the thing that you had back, you know, like 50, 60, 70 years ago. Like, this isn't the same thing from your childhood. This is new, right? The younger generation sees it as new, and the older generation sees it as a reinvention, as like almost like a reincarnation, or just like another expression of the same thing. Whether it's, I mean, a good example might just be music, right? A lot of music has reruns or like similar tunes that were used, like, you know, years ago, come back in popular music today, and people will do covers of songs, right? And the younger generation, often they only know the cover, or the cover of the cover of the cover, right? Because there's examples of that too, definitely. And so whatever new, hip, like young artist is covering an age-old song, the newer generation will be familiar with that version of it, and that'll be their new, right? when really that song has existed for years and years and years and has had so many different versions along the ages, right? Same thing happens with movies, with different stories that we tell, right? There's very little, I would say, in this world that is genuinely new. It happens from time to time, and when it does, it's marvelous and exciting and wonderful. But I think that's something that our modern society, and maybe I could do a whole other video on this, but I think our modern society struggles with originality. Because, and part of it might be because of the access to information and because of globalization, because like it's really hard to have an original thought, an original idea when we're so inundated by information and by ideas that are already out there. But that's a whole other topic that could be explored on its own. But you get this dichotomy, right? Where like the young generation, like they're obsessed with the new and the older generation just kind of looks at it and laughs and says, well, yeah, it's new to you. It's new it's new in its twist. It's a new version, but the main idea has been there for a while, right? And the younger generation doesn't want to hear that because they don't want the novelty taken away. But the older generation also gets frustrated by not having their knowledge and their insight and like of how it's been there kind of all along in different forms, how that isn't really recognized or valued or acknowledged. So again, back and forth, right? Younger generation is very good at seeing how things are now, right? They have a clearer picture of that. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Because they're actively living in and participating in life as it is now. And so they're really good at describing the present picture. They're better at that than the older generation is, because the older generation, they don't see the present picture from the perspective of someone who's discovering it for the first time, and also not from the perspective of someone who's really immersed in it, right? Because the older generation, I don't want to say that they're really like kind of set aside from society. Sometimes they are in some ways, but as we get older, we start to slow down, right? In terms of just how active. Hey, sorry, my phone ran out of memory, so I had to restart, or at least pick up from where I left off. So as I was saying, the older generation, they start slowing down. We slow down in terms of our energy, in terms of our learning ability, right? We're not able to learn things as quickly. It takes us a longer time. Hence, we kind of have that saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's this idea that, yeah, like our brains are kind of hardwired, like and a lot of our thought processes, a lot of our ways of seeing the world, our patterns, our personalities, those are ingrained, right? We've been living a certain way for so long that it's like a river, right? A river, like it keeps its course most of the time. Like to cut like a new path, like, or a new like kind of like off stream from a river, the river is going to tend to go down the path that it's always followed, right? Because it's been running that way. It's established. It runs deep. There's like a strong current, and it's been used, right? And so redirecting a river is going to be really hard. And the same thing happens. And I don't want to get too like psychological here, too, like. Yeah, this isn't a class in neurology, but like with neural pathways in our brain, it's very similar in terms of how it works. And so, yeah, it's harder. It's harder for the older generation to learn and understand new things and to develop new ways of thinking. The younger generation is a little bit better at that, right? their ways of thinking, their neural pathways, their personality, their habits, their patterns, like all of these things aren't as developed. They're not as ingrained. They haven't been practiced for as much time, and so they're a little bit more malleable, right? And so, yeah, when the younger generation, says about the older generation, for example, that they're rigid, or that they're, they're not really able to, that they're kind of strict, and they're not able to change or see things differently. They're kind of like stuck in their ways. There's a legitimate reason for that, right? It's not just an attitude thing. It's just a natural outcome of our lives. That what we practice, the things that we do, the ways that we think, the ways that we interact with the world around us, what we repeat will tend to just ingrain itself. It becomes established. It becomes like a highway, right? That's more traveled than like a little, dirt path somewhere. So yeah, there's reasons why, and the reasons are valid and they make sense if you step back and you think about it, but the younger generation often doesn't take the time to do that. And then, yeah, the same critique works the other way too, right? When the older generation looks and says, look, the younger generation, they're undisciplined, they're unstructured, they don't have, they don't have respect and tradition, and they don't have this sense of, like, they're just kind of wild and free and untamed, whatever. Like, there's a reason for that too. They have just, like, naturally more flexibility and more energy to put into that flexibility. And so, yeah, like, the world is just full of possibilities, and they haven't chosen in many ways who they're going to be yet. And they're still trying out different paths to decide which ones are going to become, my go-tos, which ones am I going to travel like the most, what's going to become my core. And so lots of things that, that we can teach each other, learn from each other. Younger generation, this is kind of, I don't want to say it's a cliche, it's not really a cliche, but this is one that's known very easily. Like, the younger generation is a lot more technologically savvy and apt, right? They've grown up with it. The older generation remembers when computers weren't even really a thing, and when the internet didn't exist. And heck, like, Google was developed in my lifetime. Like, I was alive, and I'm 30 years old, right? Like, I'm kind of in between, right? I'm not really a youth, I'm not really an elderly person yet. But I was born before Google was invented, right? And you say that to like a younger, like, teenager, like, what do you mean you existed before Google did, right? Things like this, like, they've grown up in a society and in a culture and just a life where it's just a normal part of everyday life. And for the older generation, wasn't so much like that, right? And so we have a lot that we can teach each other, a lot that we can learn from each other. Younger generation they do tend to be more open, more accepting, more flexible. Again, like, there's physiological reasons why that is the way that it is with our brains and with our, like, physical development, but as well as social and interpersonal development. Like there's reasons why it is that way, but that's also a really big advantage, like a really big positive attribute that the younger generation has that they can share with the older generation. Is like, look, we can look at things from different perspectives. There's different ways of looking at things, and that's okay. And we can entertain many of them, and we can think critically, and we can question our assumptions. Like, we can be open to things that are new and that are different from how we've done it in the past. Like, we can have a bit of both, right? I really like, I don't want to get too political here, but I really like what Jordan Peterson said in one of his lectures, one of his presentations. He was talking about the difference between, you know, like liberalism and conservatism, or if you're, you know, American from the U.S., like being a Democrat or being a Republican, right? And he said, like, there are times when it is best to rely on tradition and to rely on how things have worked in the past. There are times and situations in which using what has worked in the past, using tradition, relying on that, leaning on that, is the best way to go and is helpful. And there are other times when we need to be innovative. We have to think about things differently. We can't, like, we have to kind of ignore the past and deal with what's in front of us. And so both perspectives are helpful and needed and necessary in different situations, right? Like they're relevant and they're applicable within their sphere. What becomes dangerous is when we take one perspective and say that it is the answer for everything. Like every single situation, every single circumstance that you could ever encounter, this approach is going to be the best one. That's a little bit too simplistic. It's a little bit too reductionistic. It's a little bit too, you know, one size fits all, which isn't reflective of reality, right? And so we can take this and we can kind of apply it to ageism, I think, as well, like to this dichotomy between, you know, the perspectives and the attitudes and ways of the elderly generation versus the younger generation. There are times when tradition and when those repeated patterns and those constant things that don't really change through time, there are times and situations and circumstances where those need to be applied and remembered, and when those are helpful. There are other times when applying a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of originality, if we can find it, and thinking differently, right? And just really focusing on what is in front of us and coming up with a new idea, like kind of not abandoning the old or the traditional, but really seeing what is in front of us and approaching it differently, where change is necessary and needed and helpful. Both have their place and both work together and complement each other, but we need to find harmony in them, and we can't pin them against each other. We can't just, you know, it can't be an us versus them or a this or that. It's a this and that. And if we can work at really just bringing that together and integrating it and learning from each other and taking the good from each and giving the good to each, we all have so much to gain. And I think our society would be all the better for it. Just my personal opinion. Tell me what you think of it, and I'll see you next time.